I'm asking you to imagine your dream job. This is a job, standard job, working for a company. I'm not asking you what your preferred profession is. We'd all have a different answer. Rather, I'm asking for the description, the generic description of what type of characteristics would define your dream job. Most of us would probably say, great salary and benefits, job security, the respect of our superiors and our peers, good working conditions, maybe respect to the community, maybe some prestige. But probably a few of us, probably the majority of us, wouldn't reject a job with all of the above great benefits, even if we were told that it was easy, or that the objectives were unclear, or that part of your responsibilities were problem solving, facilitating, or ensuring good administrative data keeping. A job like this sounds pretty good. For many of us, a step up from where we are today. Well, on this topic, I've got some good news and I've got some bad news. Good news is I found this great book that will help you see how many of these jobs are available today and why there will be more of them available in the future. On the bad news, the same book spends most of its time describing how these jobs are completely horrible to do and the majority of people in them hate them. I'm XCG, and today we're doing an in-depth book review. We've got an absolute cracker of a book. Bullshit Jobs, A Theory, written by David Graeber. David Graeber is a professor of anthropology at the London School of Economics. And unlike most books written by professors, this one is fun, it's friendly, it's interesting, and it's approachable even to the casual reader. I mean, who isn't going to like a book that uses words like bullshitization? Especially in the first few chapters, I had to keep reminding myself that this is a serious book. This is a man who can write with his tongue firmly planted in cheek. He makes some excellent points, but he managed to do it while also being entertaining. Graeber's lighthearted prose, though, doesn't distract from the seriousness of the material that he covers. This book is compelling, and for the most part, it's quite convincing. The main theory presented, that we are undergoing a substantive change in modern work, and that this trend is accelerating. As the title suggests, Graeber believes that modern work is increasingly made up of bullshit jobs. Our author defines a bullshit job as follows, quote, "A form of paid employment that is so completely pointless, unnecessary, or pernicious that even the employee cannot justify its existence, even though, as part of the conditions of his employment, the employee feels obliged to pretend that this is not the case." End quote. But wait, a reader might complain. I agree, there are a lot of government workers employed in completely useless jobs, but no modern private company would ever have this type of job. After all, wouldn't the profit motivation of a private company keep them from creating truly useless jobs? This, despite our logical concerns, is precisely the well-described and documented point that our author argues. Bullshit jobs exist just as commonly in the private sector as in the public. He writes, quote, "What's significant to me, though, is that nowadays useless bureaucrats seem just as rife in the private sector as in the public sector. You're as likely to encounter an exasperating little man in a suit reading out incomprehensible rules and regulations in a bank or mobile phone shop than in the passport office or zoning board." Close quote. Another accepted wisdom in our modern world is that it's always better to have a job than to be without one, even in the case of having a bullshit job. Our author disagrees, saying many people, quote, spend their entire working lives performing tasks they secretly believe do not need to be performed. The moral and spiritual damage that comes from this situation is profound. It is a scar across our collective soul, yet virtually no one talks about it." Close quote. There are many reasons that Graeber believes that BS jobs are terrible, with one of the critical reasons being the opportunity cost. As our productivity has increased so dramatically, he feels that there is no reason that we couldn't begin reducing working hours. Quote, "But rather than allowing a massive reduction of working hours to free the world's population to pursue their own projects, pleasures, visions, and ideas, we have seen the ballooning not even so much as the service sector as of the administrative sector, up to and including the creation of whole new industries like financial services or telemarketing." Graeber writes that, according to research, our modern economy is comprised of up to 50% of all work falling into the bullshit category, with 30% of jobs being fully bullshit, and many of the remainder increasingly consumed by bullshit tasks. Graeber supports this thesis with both research data and the testimony of workers. Based on one study, he writes, quote, "The amount of time American office workers say they devoted to their actual duties declined from 46% in 2015 to 39% in 2016, owing to a proportionate rise in time dealing with emails, up from 12% to 16%, wasteful meetings, 8% to 10%, and administrative tasks, 9% to 11%, close quote. One of the longer personal worker stories, that of Eric reports, quote, "I've had many awful jobs, but the one that was undoubtedly pure liquid bullshit was my first professional job. After graduation, Eric began looking for a job. I attended an interview, which sadly led to a job. That job involved working for a large design firm as its interface administrator. The interface was a content management system, intranet with a graphical user interface, basically designed to enable this company's work to be shared across its 7 offices around the UK. The firm was a partnership, with each office managed by one partner. All of them seemed to have attended one of 3 private schools and the same design school. Being unbelievably competitive, 40-something public school boys outcompete one another to win bids. And on more than one occasion, 2 different offices had found themselves arriving at the same client's office to pitch work and having to hastily combine their bids in the parking lot of some dismal office park. The interface was designed to make the company super collaborative across all of its offices. And my job was to help develop it, run it, and sell it to the staff. I should have realized that this was one partner's idea and that no one else actually wanted to implement. Why else would they be paying a 21-year-old history graduate to do this? I was basically tasked with selling and managing a badly functioning turd. After a few months, I realized that there was very little for me to do at all, most days, aside from answer a few queries. Throughout this book's 387 pages, Graeber provides extensive theoretical, research, and anecdotal support to prove the existence and growth of the bullshit job category. Graeber takes the time to classify bullshit jobs. Categories include flunkies, goons, box tickers, duct tapers, flack catchers, and others. His list is not intended to be exhaustive and complete, rather to illustrate the extent of the problem in a simple to understand way. For instance, a box ticker is someone who does a job, so the organization can say that it's doing something and professionally managed, despite the lack of any tangible action at all. Consider a story from Betsy, a woman hired to coordinate leisure activities in a care home. Quote, "Most of my job was to interview residents and fill out a recreation form that listed their preferences. That form was then logged on a computer and then promptly forgotten about forever. The paper form was also kept in a binder, for some reason. Completion of the forms was by far the most important part of my job in the eyes of my boss. A lot of time I would complete a form for a short-term resident and they would check out by the next day. I threw away mountains of paper. The interviews mostly just annoyed the residents as they knew it was bullshit paperwork and no one was going to care about their individual preferences. Similarly, a duct taper might be someone who is hired to coordinate between departments because of frequent disagreements or difficulty of the departments working together. A duct taper is someone whose job exists to cover up a problem that no one knows how to or wants to take the time to fix. A flack catcher is an obvious role. Who hasn't been on the phone with some unfortunate phone center worker whose job is to answer calls of frustrated customers, but is given exactly zero power to satisfy those frustrations? Goons are those workers like lawyers who exist to scare the competition, consumer, or disloyal employee. The definition of flunkies speaks for itself. And I can say in my own corporate experience, that job is a category that can pay extremely well. This book spends considerable time tracking the historical development of bullshit jobs and our author's belief that we are only midway on through the trend. Quote, as the French version of Slate magazine noted in 2013, here goes with my terrible French, la bullshitisation de l'économie n'est qu'à début, which translate to the bullshitization of the economy has only just begun. While we've seen extremely rapid development of BS jobs, it is likely to continue as the underlying drivers remain active. As our economy has automated productive jobs, there has been a parallel explosion of administrative and managerial positions, as well as service jobs, to support a community where people are working longer and longer hours. As our author points out, the increase in dog walkers, delivery services, and all types of time-saving services target a working population with money but little free time. Essentially, jobs lost in traditional productive roles are reappearing as increasingly BS jobs, or as services to support employees facing increasing hours of BS. This is a reassuring trend for those of us depending on a salary to maintain our lifestyles. But it's also an unexpected one from the perspective of a century ago when workers and unions were terrified of the prospect of robots replacing manual labor. It's also especially unexpected as we ponder why we need all of these white-collar, or at least gray-collar workers when they were so completely unnecessary in the past. I think the part of the book that I liked most is how Graeber spent so much time dismantling the argument that jobs are always a good thing, and the often accepted aphorism, idle hands do the devil's work. Basically that it is always a good thing to have a person in a job, even a bad job, if the alternative is having that person be idle. I love how he dismantles these convictions so completely and from so many different angles. He starts off with a clarification of his own definition. Bullshit jobs often pay quite well and tend to offer excellent working conditions. They're just pointless. Shit jobs are usually not at all bullshit. They typically involve work that needs to be done and is clearly to the benefit of society. It's just that the workers who do them are paid and treated badly. So it isn't that BS jobs have bad working conditions. They could have, but often they do not. Rather, he agrees with Dostoevsky, quote, It once came into my head that if it were desired to reduce a man to nothing, to punish him atrociously, to crush him in such a manner that the most hardened murderer would tremble before such a punishment and take fright beforehand, it would only be necessary to give his work a character of complete uselessness. So, the conditions of work, the prestige of the job, the pay may all be fantastic, but there is a hidden and horrible underside that becomes apparent with time. Graeber bases this view in human psychology. Quote, "Human beings certainly tend to rankle over what they consider excessive or degrading work. Few may be inclined to work at the pace or intensity that scientific managers have, since the 1920s, decided they should. People also have a particular aversion to being humiliated. But leave them to their own devices, and they almost invariably rankle at the prospect of having nothing useful to do." Close quote. Graeber goes on to say, "Children come to the understanding that they exist, that they are discrete entities separate from the world around them, largely by coming to understand that they are the thing which just caused something to happen, the proof of which is the fact that they can make it happen again. Crucially, too, this realization is, from the very beginning, marked with a species of delight that remains the fundamental background of all subsequent human experience. As a result, doing a meaningless job hour after hour and day after day is, quote, not just an assault on the person's sense of self-importance, but also a direct attack on the very foundations of the sense that one is even a self. If make-believe play is the purest expression of human freedom, make-believe work imposed by others is the purest expression of lack of freedom." Close quote. So, BS jobs are damaging to humanity and to freedom because they keep people from doing something useful. We are both torturing these people and wasting precious human potential. I think that BS jobs exist is not a great insight. We've all heard about them, even if we've not done one ourselves. But it is easy to dismiss the importance of BS jobs if we believe that all work is good. BS jobs, bullshit jobs, are replacing the jobs lost to automation, allowing economic growth and the sustaining of our lifestyles. But if 50% of all work is bullshit, and this type of work is depressing, degrading, damaging, as well as robbing humanity of potential, then it becomes a huge concern. The importance of this topic drives Graeber to focus on how we view work and the history of these views. How our modern world, more often than not, accepts the moral belief that work is central to the individual's happiness, sense of pride, and is a measure of a person's value. But that humanity doesn't know what is good for it, and as a result, economic necessity must force people to work, whether they want to or not. Unfortunately, bullshit work doesn't provide them the promised benefits. Rather, silently strips people of a sense of agency, forcing them to spend hours toiling, but with nothing of value to show for it. This is the perfect psychological trap and a guarantee to maximizing torture. You have to work, but we're going to force a significant number of you to do work at jobs that actually fail to deliver the promised psychological benefits. First, you, quote, deny humans the sense of agency, and they are nothing. Then you create a society where you also have to deny your suffering, or as employee Lillian is quoted as saying, "What is it like to have a job like this? Demoralizing, depressing. I get most of the meaning in my life from my job. And now my job has no meaning or purpose. It gives me anxiety because I think that at any moment someone is actually going to realize that nothing would change if I were not here, and they could save themselves the money. It also trashes my confidence. If I'm not constantly being met by challenges that I'm overcoming, how do I know that I'm capable? Maybe all of my ability to do good work has atrophied. Maybe I don't know anything useful. I wanted to be able to handle bigger and more complex projects, but now I handle nothing. If I don't exercise those skills, I lose them. It also makes me afraid that other people in the office think the problem is me, that I'm choosing to slack off or I'm choosing to be useless. When nothing about this is my choice and all my attempts to make myself more useful or give myself more work are met with rejection and not a small amount of derision for attempting to rock the boat and challenge my boss's authority. I have never been paid so much to do so little. And I know I'm not earning it. I know my co-workers with other job titles do significantly more work. I might even get paid more than them. How bullshit would that be? I'd be lucky if they didn't hate me on that basis alone. The bloody science of economics has debated the concept of value creation extensively. It started with a measure of value creation based on labor input, but in the late 20th century switched to explain value creation where capital is the driver, with labor regulated to a less important, or in some cases, unimportant role. Quote, nowadays, if one speaks of wealth producers, people will automatically assume one is referring not to workers but to capitalists. But a more intuitive measure of labor would include measuring the total benefits generated as a result of that labor. Hard to measure, so it's quite unpopular with economists, but more likely to be viewed as people-friendly. This measure of value would rank bullshit jobs, such as pointless administration, as relatively low contributors to value, at least beyond the salary given to the workers. But bullshit jobs in general are highly paid, whereas jobs that are clearly generating value on a wider scale, such as nursing, teaching, mechanics, and yes, even cleaners, are mostly among the lower paid jobs. Graeber argues that with the exception perhaps of doctors, there is actually an inverse correlation. If we want a healthy and happy community, we wouldn't be trying to attract people into the least socially valuable jobs. But apparently this is exactly what we're doing. Based on how we allocate salaries disproportionately, what we really want is the maximum number of people doing jobs that add little value. This is a very dispiriting insight. You either can be useful and productive, but at best middle class, or you can aspire to be upwardly mobile, but you have to be willing to risk being utterly useless and unproductive. Once Graeber has supported the existence and damage caused by bullshit jobs, he moves on to diagnose what is driving bullshitization. It was in these sections of the book where I found myself a little less convinced. He does a decent job of refuting the arguments of our classical, right-leaning, free market is always best type critics. They say that inefficiency of this type shouldn't exist in a free market as it would be irrational. Besides, the free marketeers say, even if it does exist, it must be a result of government interference in free markets. Graeber responds, quote, basically such arguments fall into two broad types. Proponents of each are happy to admit that at least some of those who believe they hold pointless jobs in the public sector are correct. However, the first group argues that those who harbor similar suspicions in the private sector are not correct. Since competing firms would never pay workers to do nothing, their jobs must be useful in some way. They simply do not understand. The second group admits useless paper-pushing jobs do exist in the private sector, and even that they have proliferated. However, this group insists that the private sector bullshit jobs must necessarily be a product of government interference, close quote. The first argument is an extremely weak one. It is essentially saying that this can't happen because my preferred economic theory says it can't. Graeber, of course, trots out many personal testimonies from workers from around the globe and supports his arguments with research data. As a result, the first argument kind of falls flat, as it isn't supported with anything substantive other than prove me wrong. Of course, our free market devotee discounts all testimonies on the basis that these jobs must be important in some way that workers don't understand. In other words, they contend that their theory has to be correct, and your examples are wrong regardless of supporting facts, because all the people doing these jobs are likely dumb and capitalists are smart. Essentially what this argument is saying that I'm right until convinced otherwise, and I get to choose the data I'll accept. The second group of free market gurus makes a slightly more nuanced argument that these jobs exist, they'll agree, because there is interference in the free market. In response to this, our author writes, I don't think that I really need to dwell too much on the second argument, since the reader is likely to have encountered variations of it 1,000 times before. Anyone who truly believes in the magic of the marketplace will always insist that any problem, any injustice, any absurdity that might seem to be produced by the market is really caused by government interference. I think Graeber is doing us a slight disservice with this quotation. Essentially, he's dismissing this argument through a simple disparagement of the free marketeers, and this isn't that terribly impressive. Luckily, though, Graeber goes on to give many examples that aren't a result of government interference. So despite his casual dismissal of these critics, he does spend some time addressing their complaints. Certainly in my own career, I've seen teams of lawyers, compliance people, and administrators who are employed in response to actual or perceived regulatory requirements. Each of these roles didn't add value and existed because of quote-unquote government interference, regulation. But these regulatory requirements did not explain all, nor even most, of the bullshit jobs that I encountered. Where I had the biggest struggle with Graeber's underlying logic or explanation for the growth of bullshit jobs is when he says that the answer clearly isn't economic, it's moral and political. The ruling class has figured out that a happy and productive population with free time on their hands is a mortal danger. He goes on to point to examples of government pushing job creation, but not to support that argument with strong quantitative facts or extensive logical reasoning. Certainly, I would say that if politicians could create 100% employment, they would be incentivized to do so. But we don't see that happening as a result of government initiatives. As for the rest of the ruling class, I'm not sure who Graeber is referring to. While I am skeptical of fundamentalist free market devotees, I have to agree with them that the senior managers of businesses certainly aren't creating jobs out of moral or political conviction. I tend to believe that they have some profit or some other pragmatic reason for most of the decisions that they make. Graeber goes on to describe our current economy as one that has stopped being a purely capitalist one. Instead, he argues that our economy is better described by comparing it to a feudal society. In his description, the ruling classes control capital and exchange security with workers to get compliance, power, and wealth in exchange. I found this description fascinating and possibly insightful, but I couldn't quite get my head around it. Economics does have enough theories that broadly describe the functioning of our economy that there must be at least some free market dynamics at play. Also, there is some extremes of power in feudalism that I just don't see fitting into the conditions of workers, even workers in bullshit jobs. On the other hand, Graeber has convinced me that the growth of so many bullshit jobs is happening, and it is happening for reasons that aren't purely economic. So perhaps an older human dynamic like feudalism might fit better. Nonetheless, I struggle to compare these two concepts directly. I will admit this failing might be mine, but my take on the modern feudalism thesis is it's just not convincing and it needs further work. To go on a wild and somewhat irresponsible tangent, I would suggest that the ideas of Ivan Illich are better at explaining how these phenomenon came to be. Illich's position is that our tools have become completely out of control to the point where we serve tools rather than tools serving us. In this case, tools include our businesses, our economy, our government, as well as the machines that we use. Illich spends a lot of time discussing how our economy depends on specialization and has driven education as well as jobs to become ever more specialized. People are spending more and more time to become experts in narrower and narrower fields. This complicates our economy to the point where no one person can understand or effect any desired change. Our economy drives us rather than us, or some elite driving it. If I were to illustrate with an example from my own business specialization, which is marketing, I would describe how marketers back in the 1950s transformed over the following decades into endless subspecializations. In the earlier period, you might have marketing managers or perhaps brand managers employed in a few, but far from the majority of companies producing and selling products. But by the later period, you could have a single company employing database managers, direct-to-consumer managers, packaging managers, business-to-business managers, consumer marketing managers, trade marketing managers, sponsorship managers, brand managers, category managers, above-the-line managers, below-the-line managers, HoReCa managers, online communications managers, brand influencer managers, and on and on and on. This fragmentation of specialization and growth in marketing jobs has happened because marketing has expanded exponentially, driven by competitive forces, driven by modern communication, and driven by increasingly specific education and training. Yet, if you were to ask any experienced marketer, they will tell you that a sizable portion of what they do is unmeasurable, or it is simply impossible to link sales or revenue to their efforts. Some try to provide effective measures, but at least in my experience, I've yet to see one that couldn't be explained by other factors. A commonly used aphorism is that 50% of all marketing spending is wasted. Unfortunately, no one knows which 50%. When you stand back and you take a hard look, it isn't difficult to reach the conclusion that much of this activity exists only because it looks good. The average professional marketing manager is very convincing and professional, and everyone hopes that the money is spent with a positive benefit on the business. But no one has the mental bandwidth to be able to look at this incredible diversity of activity and understand the big picture. We have built business specialization at a level of complexity that escapes our ability to manage or understand it. So it becomes self-sustaining. We do it because our competitors have done it and they're successful. Or we do it because our MBA professor taught us a case on how this or that marketing program was the key to success for this or that brand. We do it because marketing activities look great in our corporate presentations and help convince shareholders that we are investing in our brands and the sustainability of our business. We do it because it seems like the right thing to do, and because we believe that the business needs it to grow. This trend to specialization and exponential job creation is happening in every part of our business, and it is driving huge numbers of new administrative and managerial positions. It is also requiring businesses to invest in growing numbers of support staff to keep these people at desks with working computers and competitive benefits packages. It requires the creation of more comprehensive policies and procedures to cover all the new tasks of these specializations. And don't forget the huge departments full of esoteric jobs are also extremely difficult to understand. So, to ensure that the departments work together, you need some special computer system or to collect or disseminate information, along with a team who supports the associated hardware and software. Finally, you need new layers of managers to manage all of these people, to populate our meetings, and to hopefully provide some sort of coordination and control. Is this all necessary? Definitely not. Should a CEO decide to get rid of part of these structures to reduce cost? No one knows, not definitively, and everyone probably has a differing opinion. I don't think that these tendencies are limited only to large corporations. I think it's happening in government, it's happening in universities, and it is happening in hospitals. We are complicating our lives to the point where everyone is impotent and can only sit back and observe. My bottom line here is that this book, Bullshit Jobs: A Theory, is an excellent read, and I highly recommend it to anyone interested in alternative views. Graeber's entertaining, he's convincing, so it is both pleasant and educational. He provides a great set of facts and solid logic to explain why so many of us have found our jobs so dismal, despite the multitude of loud voices around us who champion our wonderful system. The idea that we live in some sort of post-capitalism economic system is a really interesting one. Unfortunately, this book does fall slightly short of convincing me of the idea, but it does at least convince me that this is an area that requires significantly more study. After all, if the strongest proponents of our current system are capitalists, then proving that capitalism has been replaced by something else creates new common cause for both the left and the right of the political spectrum. At least we could all agree that change is necessary. Also, the book falls slightly short in convincing me the trends that are driving this change have been fully explained, and certainly has not convinced me that some elite cabal is involved in a conspiracy to keep us all working, even if that work may be complete bullshit. So, with that, actually, strong recommendation to read this book. I think that here at the end of my longest video, by far, I have to admit that I've probably talked myself out. I want to thank all of you for sticking it out with me and following through the video. Before I go, I would like to quickly remind you that I would very much appreciate your support in the form of a thumbs up or a subscribe. This is XCG, signing out and wishing all of you speedy progress on your road to freedom.